Good afternoon. You're very welcome along to this afternoon's virtual event, the FFA Forum for the Future of Agriculture 2020 online event. Today we're discussing rewarding sustainability in the food system. Now, about the forum, since its launch in 2008, the FFA has become the key Brussels event on agriculture, food and the environment. It provides a unique platform to discuss new ideas and innovation and how to deliver and accelerate the change we need to create a sustainable food system is, of course, the topic for today's debate. We will be discussing many things, including reducing or mitigating the impact of climate change, reshaping political systems, supporting new ideas for biodiversity and conservation, as well as best practice examples. Now, a little bit of housekeeping. The FFA was founded by the European Landowners Organisation, along with Syngenta, and we want to shout out today to the FFA strategic partners. We want to thank them: Cargill, the Nature Conservatory, Rabobank, WWF EU, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, Food for Thought, and John Deere. A lot of people involved behind the scenes in bringing today's event to you. Now, the event will be recorded and will be available on the FFA website. You can, of course, follow along on social media, use the hashtag FFA2020. And during our two panel debates, we want to hear questions from you, the audience. So use the Q&A function, ask the questions, keep them concise. If they're for the whole panel, say so. If they're directed at one particular individual, indicate that as well. And I will do my best to get as many of our expert panelists to answer as many of your questions as they can. We also have another tool that we're going to use to keep in contact with the audience. We want your ideas and thoughts on a series of polls that I will be asking throughout the afternoon. And we're going to do that on a program called Mentimeter. You don't need to download anything. Just go in your browser, use your tablet or your phone or your desktop and go to menti.com. And when you go there, you will have to put in a code. That will be the unique code for this event. And that is 7955630. 7955630. You will go there, tap it in, open up menti.com, and you will see your first question is already there on the screen, allowing you to vote and tell us what you think about that. Who within the food chain has the most work to do to become sustainable? I want your thoughts on that. Again, 7955630. While everyone is voting, I hope you will also be able to pay attention to our opening speech. It is my great honour to present the FFA Chairman, former EU Commissioner for Science and Research and former European Commissioner for the Environment, Janez Potočnik. Over to you, Janez.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Thank you also to our speakers, both in the studio and around Europe. Once again, we are not able to meet in person as we had hoped to do. With corona cases once again on the rise, I hope that you and your loved ones are, of course, safe and healthy. However, we cannot let such moments of acute crisis overwhelm us. Indeed, we must use them to make the changes in the world due to crises with deeper roots, a chronic crisis of globalization and economic transformation, feeding climate change and income inequality, and also leading to potential massive unemployment. Our shared history is rich and full of critical turning points such as these. As we continue to grasp with the impact of this pandemic, we cannot allow our focus to only be on tomorrow. We must plan for a sustainable future. The urgency of the moment cannot be understated. Amidst the stories of elections and new measures, others were unfolding. September of this year was the warmest month on record worldwide. The Arctic sea ice is melting to the levels never seen before. And according to a new study done by FFA partner, the World Wildlife Fund, we have lost 68% of all global vertebrates. We are clearly on an unsustainable course, and we must be guided by a new compass. Today, we are supposed to talk about rewarding sustainability in the food system. Let me put it in perspective and start with the question, what is actually driving our efforts in organizing the FFA debates? Good life for farmers in a sustainable farming ecosystem, providing access to healthy food, The economic and food systems we have developed, often with good intentions, are not sustainable, and the change is unavoidable. Farmers deserve a decent life, where they are rewarded by the market for what they produce, not by automatic subsidies. They also deserve our support in the transition to a sustainable food system, protecting soil, biodiversity, and the climate. These are all changes in their interest. But also consumers deserve decent life, an income to raise a family, as well as good, nutritious food at reasonable prices. We are all participants in the marketplace now, and the signals that is sent are mostly driven by price. However, these signals do not represent us fully. We live in an age of poverty and wealth inequality, all pointing to an undervaluation and lack of rewards for labor. In principle, we agree that consumers and producers should pay the full costs linked to what they buy. However, many around the world cannot even afford basic services like decent food or access to homes and mobility. Since income and wealth distribution is so unbalanced, we need social and labor policies that make the basics of life affordable. We need to keep people warm, safe, and with full bellies. However, our future well-being absolutely depends on the natural environment and on the way we manage natural resources. Too many still do not understand that any future economy is totally dependent on accepting that there are hard boundaries to continued life on this planet. Even worse, many do understand this, but refuse to act accordingly. Right now, there is no real value for our natural capital. Climate change, biodiversity loss, ongoing emissions, and the destruction of the rainforest show that we do not value nature at all. Very often, it makes more economic sense to destroy the planet. It leads to better share prices and higher profits. It will not be easy, but we must reconcile our short and long-term interests. In many cases, doing so will help resolve many current, very concrete short-term interests. In democracies, we rule and govern together through the elected representatives we prefer. Imperfect though it is, this is the voice of the people. And if they do not agree with the decision made, they will raise their voice in the streets and vote us out. Nature, on the other hand, has no voice, and its life and survival depends on the existing level of human understanding and responsibility. When nature disagrees with our behavior, it cannot raise the voice. It protests by dying out and by disappearing from the planet. And yes, the silent voice of nature has been in the recent decades very loud and clear, but we still pretend not to hear the silent spring. Right now, we need much more effective and efficient policies that address the core drivers of our problems: inequality, biodiversity loss, climate change. There is no longer room for separate policies on the economy, society, and the environment. We can no longer afford inconsistency or a lack of science-based policy. We have to introduce responsible governance while avoiding hypocrisy, which leads us again to the importance of market signals. We cannot and should no longer avoid the fact that the price signals currently do not value the climate, our soil and water, or our biodiversity. Neither is there a full accounting for consumer-facing issues such as obesity and other diet-related illnesses. Another major challenge is related to rebalancing price in our food system and rewards along the food chain. Many actors, including farmers, know that the system they are part of is unsustainable. But they are trapped by existing prices, squeezed margins, and in many cases, little control over the market they contribute to. While farm incomes have risen significantly over the last 10 years, the family farm income is still only just over 15,000 euro per year. How are they supposed to buy new equipment that saves fuel, time, and reduces emissions? Where does the money come from to buy new filters for livestock sheds? How does it come that a local butcher pays only a bit extra for a meat from animals with a high quality of life. For many years, policymakers have tried to change behavior through the Common Agriculture Policy and increased regulation. As we can see from the state of our environment, these efforts, though worthy, have not delivered the systemic changes needed. The market signals in the food chain are broken and must be fixed. Furthermore, we must investigate and develop food system markets for biodiversity protection, as well as the climate, while we are slowly creating private markets for carbon storage. For example, through tree planting as a carbon offsets, they are still negligible in comparison to the global challenge we face. In the face of the global wave of forest fires from California to the Amazon to Australia, they are not nearly sufficient. When it comes to respecting value of the influence of the food system to protect the earth wildlife, we are functionally nowhere. Despite a limited number of private initiatives, we have no unified system that tells us how to translate the extraordinary value of our wildlife into a system that can reward those that help them prosper beyond nature subsidies. Dear friends, while addressing the issue of rewarding sustainability in the food sector, we have to be clear that it is impossible to solve the problems linked to agriculture and food system in isolation. Few quick points worth mentioning. We have to simultaneously address social questions linked to poverty and fairness. We cannot simply march out and demand higher prices from consumers. Transition should be always managed carefully, with most vulnerable in mind. Right now, hundreds of thousands are losing their jobs, taking salary cuts, and even more are facing real insecurity. We cannot ask of them to pay more without making them more secure and well paid first. This means tackling the gross levels of inequality that have ballooned around the world and also in Europe. Second, the financial sector should actively contribute to the transition. Risks in finance institutions cannot be anymore defined as the short-term rate of return of the money invested, but rather in the context of real risks we face as a society, where finance plays an outsized role. Looking beyond the short-term interest is essential not only for the transition of the food system, but also for the stability and survival of the finance sector itself. Third, all public money should follow public interests, aligned with the needs of the transition following the European Green Deal vision. The opportunity is unique. While the next financial perspective and recovery package we have on table with the next financial perspective and recovery package, we have on the table for the next few years almost doubled regular European Union budget. And if we act wisely, lots can be done. European Green Deal and post-recovery should be seen as part of the same fund. I'm also aware that Europe is not an isolated island and that the youth to all the questions how do we create the engaging in global partnerships and solutions on the globalized markets should thus be an important part of the future European efforts. Dear friends, incentives sent to markets are essential. We cannot send producers and consumers with market signals in one direction and then use the regulation and additional public money to limit the damage done by the wrong market signals. This just leads to a lot of confusion, lobbying, and also potentially to conflicts and bad will. It is essential that signals sent to market players, producers and consumers, farmers, and then customers are aligned with public interests, like providing affordable, healthy food, respecting planetary boundaries, using natural resources in a responsible way, and not working against, which is currently many times still the case. Policymakers should create conditions for them to thrive and to jointly shape an economy which will, by following their private interests, protect also the public ones. This is an essential role and responsibility public sector policymakers and politicians should play. And while engaging in our economic activities, we should always remain caring members of our society. Fixing the market signals in the food system, it's extraordinarily hard and may require some changes which would not be easy to accept. We might have to pay more, consume less, be more conscious of our food waste and become more active citizens. These are not easy challenges, but we are running out of time. If we do not face up to it and fix our broken compass, then the consequences will be unbearable, not only for the future generations, but already also for us. The current crisis provides us with a moment of fragility enlightenment in which we can make a real change, and we must make it. I hope today's discussions will inspire you to ask questions and consider your own role as a company, a government, or even as individual. We all win or lose together. It is not anymore about if and what needs to be done, but rather about how we will do it. I wish you a productive conference and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Before I ask you a quick follow-up question, let's take a look at the results of our first poll from Mentimeter, the first question that we asked our audience, just to take a little bit of the temperature of what people are thinking. So that first question, I think if we can see it, it was who within the food chain has the most work to do to become sustainable? Now, this was a multiple choice, so there are a few different options that you could have chosen from. You had farmers, food and beverage processing companies, retailers, consumers, or all of the above. Let's see what the results were. Okay, it was all of the above. Yes, indeed. 15% for farmers, only 7% and 5% respectively for food and beverage processing companies and retailers, 13% for consumers. Are you surprised by those results, or is that more or less what you would have expected as well?
It's not only 7% and 5% of the figures which you mentioned for retailers and food producers, because you add also 59, all of them together.
Yeah.
And I'm not surprised at all. I think it's the correct answer and also very much expected. So it's clear that this is our joint task, which we have to address in cooperation.
Okay, and then one other question I want to ask you before we let you go today. You mentioned in your speech, and I would like you to say a little bit more about how to tackle the levels of inequality in our society.
Listen, this is not something which we will solve today with this webinar or around the table. It goes very, very deep. It goes into the roots of how the income, it's actually what are the income rewards? I'm many times saying in a bit simplified way, but you can actually conclude that from the data that productive capital, which is in a way a synonym for GDP, it's overvalued and over-rewarded. That labor capital, it's undervalued and under-rewarded, and that natural capital in many cases is unfortunately not valued at all, which it's leading us to the core problems which we are discussing today. And you can't solve only the problems of the natural capital story, because this would be clearly linked also to the questions of how you price some of the things on the markets without addressing seriously also the social issues. So the transition to a more sustainable economy and society, in particularly we here mean environmentally, will fall or will fly on the basis if we will done it well and if it will be also acceptable for those who are the most vulnerable.
Thank you very much for your input for today's discussions. Thank you for framing the debate that we will have going forward for the rest of this afternoon. No doubt you will stay tuned and submit your suggestions as well. Thank you very much. Now, we have got, of course, Mentimeter again. You should see on your screens the second question there, which sets us up for the beginning of our second session, which is the panel. Now, if we go to the screen again, we should be able to see our next question. Can we see the next Mentimeter question, please? Our next panel is going to be the discussion on sustainable business models and paying for the transition. So our second question is related to this paying for the transition. So you can go there and cast your votes. Please do so while I get on with introducing our speakers for session 2, or rather the panel session 1, but the second part of today's event. So we have joining us remotely, we have Eduardo Coco, who is the director of iForm Organics Europe. Joining me here in the studio, we have Ben O'Brien, director from Europe of Beef and Lamb New Zealand, and also Bas Rutter, global head of sustainability at Rabobank. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me. Ben, let me start with you. The question for this panel is sustainable business models and paying for the transition. Give me your opening thoughts and your opening comments to set out the rest of our debate.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here today, and I'd like to thank the organisers for this opportunity to address you this afternoon, to give you a perspective from New Zealand on how we go about the business of sustainable food production. We've just heard from the chairman that the market signals in the food chain are broken and must be fixed. I agree, but perhaps rather than being completely broken, maybe they're just being a little distorted. For the past 4 years, I've been observing European agriculture and involved in discussions and debates on the regulatory and trade environment, talking to my European counterparts about their farm businesses and the impact that consumers, society, and government have on them. When I came here 4 years ago, I was struck by what was to me a different agricultural policy environment, characterised by special pleading and intense lobbying, focusing on the size of a subsidy budget, who should get what from it, and under what conditions. As you are no doubt aware, New Zealand abolished all its farm subsidies in the mid-1980s. We are by no means unique. Of course, a significant number of other countries have few or no subsidies. So in New Zealand, there are no single farm or direct payments, no eco payments or subsidies for fertiliser, farm equipment or animal welfare. Farm businesses are treated like any others and are expected to bear the full costs of their operations themselves. On top of that, industries have to pay for government services such as market access, traceability and post-border biosecurity. You can be sure, though, that under a user pays regime, industry is well motivated to ensure these activities operate efficiently and are accountable. So with no subsidies, there is less lobbying and strong, clear market signals. It means farmers focus on their businesses rather than completing forms for government payments or modifying their businesses to be eligible for government funding. So that's the context in which we operate. So how does New Zealand agriculture approach the issue of sustainability? Well, first of all, there's the law. The Resource Management Act prohibits impacts on natural resources and sets out a management enforcement regime. Everyone has to comply with the law at their own cost. It's effects-based, that is to say, it prohibits detrimental effects on the environment rather than prescribing prohibited or permitted actions. So an example would be that there is no national or even regional limit on fertiliser application, but there are local limits on nutrient levels in waterways. This places the broader responsibility for protecting the environment on the land users, but allows them freedom of action in how they go about avoiding nutrient loss to waterways. Climate change law includes an emissions trading scheme, which puts a price on carbon, and the recent Zero Carbon Act designed to meet our obligations under the Paris Agreement with the national objective of being carbon neutral by 2050. The agricultural sector has pledged to achieve its targets through a program entitled He waka eke noa. Roughly translated, that means we're all in the same canoe, or we're all on the same journey together. The result will be a nationwide farm-level reporting and pricing of emissions. The sheep and beef sector, for its part, has already reduced emissions by over 30% since 1990, and we have recently completed a study of vegetative sequestration on our farms, which puts above-ground carbon storage at 90% of emissions on an annual basis. On the freshwater side, what are we doing? Well, at the highest level, the quality of fresh water must be maintained or improved. On farm, it means a mandatory freshwater module must be incorporated into farm plans. Farm plans started out as management tools developed and promoted by organisations such as the one I work for, to help farmers identify environmental risks on their farms and develop plans to manage them. Local authorities have since adopted them within their regulatory requirements. I've mentioned some of the latest regulatory initiatives, but alongside these are the commercial imperatives. Meat exporting companies have long had requirements placed on them by their customers, most notably the supermarket chains that apply very strict specifications for the products they purchase. They have no difficulty in exerting their considerable market power to ensure high standards are met. As a result, processors and exporters in New Zealand have always had very strict conditions of supply. The compliance, verification, and audit requirements are ever increasing and are now incorporated into a National Farm Assurance Program, the NZFAP. Finally, the NZFAP provides a quality and compliance framework for the Taste Pure Nature promotional program that's being rolled out in selected global markets in support of company marketing programs. There, in a nutshell, is an idea of how New Zealand is dealing with the issue of sustainability. It's an alignment of policy, regulation, technology and education, market signals, and commercial disciplines. Farmers and processors are strongly incentivised in their businesses to provide a product that meets the highest of sustainability standards to a global market. I'd like to think, too, that it's not just the law and profits that motivate our farmers to become more sustainable, but also a strong inner desire to make the world a better place for future generations. A motivation I'm sure they share with their colleagues here in Europe. I hope that this brief snapshot is helpful. Ngā mihi mō tō aro.
Thank you very much. Now, just a reminder again, before we go to our next speaker for this panel, that you have a question that you can answer on Mentimeter, which is who should pay for the implementation of greater sustainability in the food system. We'll come and see the results of that after we've heard the opening statements from each of our three speakers. And our second speaker is Eduardo Cuoco. Eduardo, let me give the floor to you for your opening thoughts.
Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome to everybody who is connected and watching us. I'm Eduardo Cuoco, the Director of Organics Europe, and I'm very glad for being here with you. So I would like to thank the ELO for inviting me. Let's frame a bit the discussion from an organic point of view. We do believe that the agro-industrial intensification, the industrial agriculture model that we have now, is generating a vicious circle. And this intensification is giving as a result a threat to productivity, and then it requires further intensification and new industrial solution. Indeed, this system has succeeded to provide a large quantity of food products for the international market. However, this system also produced a large number of negative effects on the environment, on the socioeconomic, as well as on health and well-being of our community. So, we believe that just diminishing, for example, chemical input in a system that doesn't work could reduce some negative effect, but will not be sufficient to provide a long-term solution in a very comprehensive manner. So that's why we believe that it's crucial and fundamental to call for a change of the agricultural system, a model that goes into a virtuous circle where inputs are minimized, soil preserved, organic matter is increased, diversification brings together livestock crops, and we also increase biodiversity. We believe that such a transition will bring together and will be stronger and will bring a stable output, reducing the need for further industrialization solution. So we are called today to discuss about pricing and how we can make, who is going to pay for this transition. Well, I think when it goes to cost for the transition, we need to think about it in a very holistically way. On one hand, we need policy who will help farmers to create new business model for rewarding of the public goods that they deliver to society. For example, what we do, what organic farmers do. On the other hand, we need that the enlargement for sustainable organic products is on the market. So we need to enlarge the market, and we need to guarantee in the meantime that all farmers get a fair and stable price for their production. I mean, despite the COVID-19 crisis, every year for the last 10 years, in average 325,000 full-time equivalent jobs were disappearing in the agriculture and food sector in Europe every year. Almost 4 million farmers lost their farm in the last 10 years. So we do believe that taxpayer money should really be used to reward those farmers who are contributing to the creation of the virtuous circle that I described above. We should also take into account that taxpayers are often really going in the wrong direction. I mean, currently, when a consumer is buying a product on the shelf of a supermarket, very often is paying for its product 4 times. At the counter of the supermarket, with their portion of taxes for a health sanitary system, with their taxes to restore the environment and mitigate climate change, and finally to the portion of their taxes going to the, for example, the common agriculture policy, which might reward farmers who are just instead picking up the vicious circle of having more and more industrial solution. So in this frame, we believe that the farm to fork was a very interesting approach from the Commission. So in the context of the Green Deal, the farm to fork set a very interesting sustainable driven target. And we believe that this should be more and more reflected into binding policy. And we understood that what happened last week in the European Parliament and the Council for what regards the common agricultural policy was not going exactly in this direction. But we still hope that the Commission will put all their efforts in trying to mitigate what was discussed in the Parliament and in the Council. To go to an end to my introduction, I would like to say that going to market and enlarging the market of sustainable products is a shared responsibility. We as organic sector, since long time, are organized together. Farmers, processor, trader, retailers, input provider. We discuss a lot together how we can reduce the cost of input and reward farmers for the contribution they give to the societal challenges. But we believe that to support a market, a better market for sustainable products, we need really different mechanisms. First, a mechanism that really reinforces the strength of cooperating between producer, processor, retailers in order to have prices that remain stable and ensure a fair remuneration to the producer. Then we believe that we need a progressive target in those policies who can really influence the market, such as, for example, procurement, public procurement. I mean, this can be a tool for policymakers to really support a transition toward more sustainable agri-food system. And then we do believe that member states can use taxation tools to support market. I mean, in the Green Deal communication, Ursula von der Leyen has put as an example the possibility for member states to reduce VAT on organic products. I mean, we believe this is an interesting idea, as well as we believe that might be an interesting idea having taxation on those harmful substances that are used in agriculture. So that's a bit my introduction. I hope this can help to enhance a better discussion with the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Once again, a reminder to our audience that your expert speakers are ready to answer your questions, so do use the Q&A option to send your questions through. And now we will hear the opening thoughts of our final speaker, Bas Rutte from Rabobank. Bas, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for having me. A really good discussion at the right moment in time, I would say. But let me open briefly, because I think the dialogue with the people listening would be even more valuable than just my introduction. I have 4 points to make that I would like to introduce to you briefly, and then have a little bit more in-depth insight. I think in order to be able to reward sustainability in the food system in the way it should be done in the long run, it's truly important as a first item that we introduce true prices. So true prices means that the collective value of the services and the goods produced are reflected in what we need to pay when we go to the supermarket. I think in general it is clear that that has not yet been the case, and as a result people make different choices than what is logic and good. Secondly, if we think that that is the right approach, then it's also important that we as financial institutions make sure that we integrate those types of true prices in our products and services. So the access to and the price of credit should be linked to the sustainability performance of our clients. Thirdly, I think it's truly important that we do not see this something as the market or the government or an individual player in the supply chain. It's a collective challenge to enhance sustainability in the food system. And as a result, it requires coalitions, if possible, wide coalitions, to actually realize those goals. And fourthly, yes, there is a role to play by the government, both on a regional level, a national level, and also at EU and global levels. So that's an important thing to say, but it is definitely not the only one to play a role. Now on true pricing, I think it's important that the market has the basic power to steer the consumer preferences. Market prices define how we value goods, and the fact that negative external effects are not priced in proves that our market is not yet perfect, and we need to repair that. But it's complex, it involves influencing vested interests, and therefore it requires time and commitment of all players. Not to say the least, it requires consensus on what external effects are and how they should be weighed. So it's not easy. But economists will say that despite those hurdles, it's the most efficient way to influence consumer behavior without major public interference. And I think in the long run, in the way we've organized society, that is the road to go. And we think this is the most robust intervention, but a lot to be done. Now, secondly, on the role of the bank, because of course you need to put your money where your mouth is if you make a statement like that. We're a cooperative bank focusing on agriculture, and as a result, we are focusing on long-term client relationships. And that also requires that the challenges we face on climate, on biodiversity, on the health effects of food, are definitely things that we need to take into consideration. And that's why we've already 10 years ago started cooperating in a number of coalitions to actually introduce those types of measurement systems that help us to value those external effects, both positive and negative, in our service model. So to give you an example, we've worked with Royal Friesland Campina and the Worldwide Fund for Nature to introduce the biodiversity monitor for the dairy industry, which actually measures on farm level how they contribute to the biodiversity on their farm. That is, in a limited number of indicators, a very pragmatic way of measuring their performance. After finishing that, and that is now seen as a mainstream initiative to actually measure that performance on farm level for dairy farmers, we have also started to introduce the same monitor development for crop row farming. And we hope to be able to also use that tool going forward in our client servicing. And thirdly, but very importantly, also already mentioned, when it comes to soil, we have developed the Open Soil Index, which is actually an index in which we measure the soil quality of our clients from a physical perspective, from a chemical perspective, structure, but also the biodiversity in the soil. And also that is a way of measuring sustainability performance. Now it's important to say that this is a way of actually identifying strengths and weaknesses in our client base, where we hope to be able to promote the performance of our clients going upwards over time. And it is clear that we want to integrate that also in our pricing schemes and in our risk management systems. So we feel that improving that performance needs to be a journey between the bank and the client together. And we've had very positive feedback on the pilots we're doing. We hope to be able to integrate that in all our client servicing throughout food and agriculture. Now, the third one I mentioned is coalitions. And I think it's a key thing that we not just look at government or at individual consumers or at farmers, but we need to combine efforts in order to realize results. And a good example, very practical, is what is called the Delta Plan for Biodiversity Recovery. That was an initiative here in the Netherlands, in which farmers, but also nature conservation agencies, the government, but only in a sounding board role, but not so much in controlling the initiative, the water management bodies, they all work together to identify how we can actually work on revitalizing the countryside in the next decade to come. And we've been working on a number of topics, from shared values to earning models, laws and regulation to area-specific solutions, and on monitoring whether things actually go in the right direction. So that is definitely something where we see potential moving upwards if you combine a wide coalition where people work together. We see a lot of energy popping up, and we even see voluntary coalitions to actually raise the minimum standards for dairy produced, if we are able at the same time to safeguard that the true price will be paid by the farm gate. So we see definitely that working together works out. And then, of course, fourth and finally, a role for the government is definitely there to play. It is on an EU level, it's on a national level, but for instance also on a regional level, where we see that with a very large intensity of people living in Europe in general, but of course specifically also, for example, in the Netherlands, many of the issues we face on sustainability are also linked to spatial planning. We live with a lot of people in very small areas, and the optimal setup of those areas, combining agriculture, nature conservation, but also where cities and villages are situated, requires a collective effort. So we spend a lot of time with the government to identify how we can optimize the land being used and therefore minimize external effects, while at the same time revitalize the countryside. So those would be my four things to look into in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bas. Now, you outlined a lot there, and we've got a lot of questions already coming in. But first, let's go to our Mentimeter results and see the results of that question. Who should pay for the implementation of greater sustainability in the food system? Once again, the answer is all of the above. I'm starting to wonder if maybe we shouldn't have given you that option because it's the easy answer. But we see there a little bit more for private sector and for consumers rather than public funding. Let me start, Ben, by just asking you, does that result surprise you, or is it entirely expected?
I think, as you say, it's the easy option. Certainly from our perspective, there's only ever one group that pays, and that's the consumer. So you're always producing. In the end, it's a business of producing food products for consumers. And you need to be able to make a living from what it is that they're prepared to pay. So it's absolutely vital that the kind of price that you get is a true price, a real market price, not one which has been distorted or subsidised.
Thank you for your thoughts. I'll ask now that we go on to the next question for the Mentimeter, question for our audience, because We shouldn't just make all the panelists do the hard work. And that's what should mandatory labelling include. We'll come back in a few moments to see what your votes on that have been. As we can see in real time, people are already going for both. Again, it's the easy option. But to turn now, let me come back. Bas, I wanted to ask you, you know, this question is who pays? And, you know, as a bank, how often are you asked this question?
Very, very frequently. And I definitely think that in general, it is true that primary production is being paid by the consumer. And as a result, that's the logic thing to look at when you want to improve stuff. But at the same time, we also see imperfections in the market. So there's a lot of external effects that we currently don't price in. And as a result, people tend to make choices that they would have done differently if they would have understood what the indirect effects are of their purchasing. So I definitely think that we can no longer see agriculture purely as a private thing happening on the countryside. We need to understand that agriculture has a very important positive role to play in actually living in a place where it's worth living. And at the same time, there are currently negative external effects that we collectively need to minimize. And that cannot just be put on the plate of the farmer. It needs to be collectivized. So we need to, as a society, also value that raising sustainability performance among primary production, which is the food of us all, requires an investment by us all, either in a monetary compensation or in raising the bar for everyone, so that there's a level playing field in which we all produce and consume sustainably. We need to do it together again.
Eduardo, I'm sure you'll agree with most of what you've heard already. But let me ask you a little bit of a question more about, if you like, speed. So consumers really change their behavior very, very slowly. We already know that governments and policy happens at really a really glacial speed as well. So does that mean that food companies are the only hope to force a real change towards sustainable mass consumption in this short or medium term?
Let's start from the fact that sustainability cannot be achieved from one day to another. So it takes time to work on sustainability and make an agricultural food system sustainable. And all the different components of the supply chain needs this time. I mean, farmers need time to convert their farm, for example, to an organic management system, and so on does the industry and the retailing. So speed is indeed important, but it's also important to take the right speed to convert properly towards a more sustainable food system. So what we need to do, as I said before, is really to look at this transition with an holistic approach, to see how policy can support from one side the agri-food chain to make the transition happening, but also how can they support the market of those products in the first place. So we should really speed up in these regards, making policy that help the market to develop. And then we need to work on consumers' behavior, and we need to work on education to consumer. We need to explain them why this transition is important and why it's important that they choose sustainability instead of cheap prices. Let me say that we, as organic sector, when we look at prices, our farmers are the one who are having the best margins compared to conventional farmers. But we do believe that this is not enough. We do believe that we need fair prices for all the farmers. And at the moment, the food that we sell at the farm gate is too cheap, is way too cheap. And consumers really do not understand that what they are saving in money, they are paying elsewhere. So I mentioned before some example of how this is paid, but we need to communicate. I mean, explaining to consumer the true cost of food, what Bas said before, is not an easy task, but it's something that we need to start doing, and this requires really all the actors working together and making sure that there is a good communication among the supply chain and then towards the consumers.
Thank you, Bas. I mean, and Eduardo, Ben, the same question to you then regarding this speed. Are companies the way to force things to happen, given that consumers and policy changes happen very slowly?
Well, I mean, first of all, change can only happen as fast as it's technically possible, okay? So that means that you need to have the science behind you in order to modify your behaviours. Secondly, the rate at which people will change their behaviours is dependent upon their incentives to change. So when you blunt those signals, when you spread costs across a society instead of putting it on the people who should bear those costs, then you reduce the rate of change. And then I guess the third thing is really that farmers will produce to what consumers want. And so, to a large extent, the main driver of change is always going to be the consumer, because I believe they're the ones that have the strongest lever to be able to impact on what people produce and how they produce it.
Bas, I want to turn to you with a question specifically related to the different regions of Europe. Now, they have a far greater level of intensity in certain sectors than in others. So how do we prevent a protective instinct on the part of individual member states or countries while, they're sensitive to the demands of voters? That's the reality of the world we live in. So how can the real food chain be supported with political support?
That's not an easy question, and I totally understand the way the Common Agricultural Policy is moving towards more autonomy also in dividing the subsidies, because I do think that I'm trained as an ecologist. There are differences within Europe when it comes to the countryside and factors for production. At the same time, I think it's important that we do not accept blindly the fact that farm subsidies have been used in many, many different ways throughout the countries within the European Union. And they need to focus on the results that are agreed upon at EU level. So I'm totally in favor of different measures and different subsidy schemes in different member states, as long as they strive for the same goal. And when I look at what's currently going on in the dialogue around the Common Agricultural Policy and the friction with the Farm to Fork strategy, that I fear that in some member states this is seen as an urgent thing to look into, and as a result the money should be used to create incentives to do the right thing. But in other markets I think the subsidies are still potentially used in a way that do not optimally move our production system in the right direction. So I think if at an EU level we want to have the same movement going on, it needs to be used and applied in a similar way throughout the EU in order to maintain a level playing field. Because a level playing field and true pricing are preconditions for consumer behavior shifting in the right direction, I would say.
Eduardo, the same question to you. What are your thoughts on the political situation and political support?
Sorry, I needed to unmute. As I said, I was a bit concerned looking at the results that were discussed, for example, about the Common Agricultural Policy last week. We could see that both the European Parliament and the Council did not really support this transition toward a more sustainable food system. And this is a concern. If we really want to achieve a more sustainable approach, we need all the different parties working together. And as I said, I think there is a very important role also for local policy, for regional policy, and for really local authority. So we need to bring all of them together. We hope that the indication given by the European Commission with the Green Deal can really be uptaken at all the different levels. We need politicians move fast to understand what the citizens are asking for and take action. As I said, should not be underestimated the role of local government at city and regional level. They can also play a major role when it goes to deployment of local food policy and when it goes to procurement of food, which represent a very important market that can be shaped by policymakers.
I want to turn now to you, Ben, with a question that has come in from the audience, from Konstantin Golenbeck from Fertilizers Europe, in fact, to get the New Zealand perspective. And he's asking, what benefits does New Zealand see in focusing on the regulation of nutrient losses instead of limiting the use of fertilizers? Do you want to tackle that question?
Sure, no problem. I think the important thing about the whole of our Resource Management Act and approach to externalities, which I guess is what we've been talking about, is that it's those impacts on the environment which we're trying to avoid. Now, that can be achieved in a lot of ways, and sometimes it's best not to have politicians and bureaucrats decide exactly how they should be done, but to rather let the professional land managers make decisions which they believe are going to be most effective within their local environment to achieve the outcomes that have been set for them by society, by their community. So that then allows our farmers or land users to take into account all the factors involved in what causes nutrients to go into waterways, the climate, the soil type, the types of livestock that are being operated, the crops, the application techniques, and all those things in a way where they try to optimize the management of that whilst looking to ensure the outcome, knowing that if they fail to achieve the outcome, they're going to be held responsible, and that's going to be a cost to them.
Playing out there as we're seeing here in the EU. I want now to look at the results of our Mentimeter poll, the last one that we had asked there. Of course, everybody went for the easy answer once again, with very little difference between nutritional scoring only and environmental performance only. Bas, reflect on that. Which would you have voted for if I'd taken both off the table?
To be honest, I would have said the same to be. I also voted for both. I think the essence of food is the fact that we all rely on it to be healthy, and we also appreciate food as a very important part of our culture, and you need to be well informed to make decisions. At the same time, I think what is lacking significantly currently is that there's no consensus on the externalities I described when it comes to the real price of food. So we have not yet been able, and to be honest, we are looking into it jointly also with a number of people from the science side to actually identify how we can value externalities in order to be able to come to a true price. Because I think consumers in an optimal system can make informed choices, and on the basis of that, help steer the system into the right direction. And in order to be able to do so, you need information on both elements. So it's definitely not one of the two. I think, to be honest, both are not as good developed as many of the financial indicators, including price at the cashier, are when you're in the supermarket. So we need to enhance the quality of both, and we need to have more detailed information available for consumers all over the world, including Europe, unfortunately.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question from an audience member, as it's very close to one I was going to ask myself anyway, which is from René Notborn from Farm Mode Europe. And the question is, how big or an important a role do you see of supermarkets playing in the sustainability discussion? So, I mean, retail obviously plays a huge role, but they will bear the brunt of displeasure of consumers when it comes to prices. What is the role, anyway, Eduardo, for retailers in general in delivering on sustainability?
Yeah, I think it's the easy answer, but retailers should be working together with all the other actors. They play a very important role because they are in contact directly with the consumer, so they can really make the difference. And I was discussing with our retailers last week, the briefing about this new situation of COVID-19, and we shared that in overall Europe, for example, organic products have raised their sales in supermarket, and many of them have tried to to make them more available for consumers. So many consumers have decided to pay a little bit more for organic and spend a little bit on less to have a more sustainable food. So I think really retailers can play an important role because they can help us in explaining to consumers how the price of a product is built on. I mean, what Basi said on externality and true cost is a really important issue. And it's not easy to explain to people how we can, how really the price should be built to make it accessible to consumers. So we should work more and more with retailers to make this is possible. And then let me say, I don't want to get into the details of this labeling about nutrition or environment, the two options you put on the table. But I think what we should really do is to have to incentivize consumption of healthy food by reducing the price for the consumers and by re-equilibrating the price along the supply chain.
Ben, the same question to you regarding the role of retailers. How important are they in driving change?
Well, I think they're very important in the sense that they very often act as a proxy for consumers and a gatekeeper, right? And that consumers, to some extent, rely on the retailers to ensure that appropriate standards are being applied to the products that the consumers are looking to buy, whether it be animal welfare or sustainable on-farm production or whatever. And that's tied up, I think, also in the supermarket brands. It's an opportunity for them to present to their consumers the sorts of things that they say they're going to look after for the consumer. And I think that is a really useful tool.
Well, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question before I come on to Bas on that one, because it has come in from an audience member, from Tom Murphy, from the Professional Agricultural Contractors of Ireland. He asks, Ben, with no food subsidies in New Zealand, is this reflected in a much higher cost of living?
Yes.
Okay. Right, well, that was a very succinct answer. Bas, will you be quite as succinct when I ask you to explain from your perspective the role of retailers and perhaps reflect on the cost of living question as well?
Well, first of all, I think it's great that we have food that doesn't take 60 or 70% of our income. But at the same time, I think food at the moment is too cheap. I happen to live in the country where the percentage spent of your income on food is least in the world. And I do definitely think that we look at the negative externalities of it. So that's just a side remark. When it comes to retail, I think there are two things that are really important to see. First of all, because of the fact that the average consumer is relying so strongly on retailers in their day-to-day choices, this also comes with responsibility for those retailers to actually live up to those expectations and to take that responsibility not too lightly. And I see increasingly that they are picking that up. I mean, I need to say that a number of the choices to be made within the supermarket today are much better informed than they used to be 10 or 15 years ago. At the same time, I see that while COVID was emerging, we saw a very strong trend towards local food. Many people saw that the long supply chains we rely on today, without too much of a knowledge of the individual consumer, whether that is actually going on, they were breaking. And we've been able to repair most of them in the Western world, but many of the supply chains in the South are still broken. And I think we also need to rebalance how we value the length of those supply chains. And I think if you know the farmer whose food you eat, if you understand the way your milk is produced and that the cow is involved, then you are also much easier able and willing to pay the real price that actually safeguards the proper environment you want to live in, the healthy food you want to eat, but also you respect the fact that you need to pay the farmer to produce it in a proper way. So I really think that retailers have a role to play in making people aware how their food was being produced and the impact that the production way, the way it was produced, has on the day-to-day environment you would like to work in, live in, recreate in during the weekend. And that's a really important role for retail. I see it moving in the right direction, but there's definitely more needed in order to have a more visible impact of those retailers on those types of dilemmas for consumers.
Thank you. Now, we're getting quite a lot of questions in, particularly now on the question of true prices. Keep your questions coming. Do send them in using the Q&A function on your screen. This one, it's directed at Bas, but I think I'm going to ask Eduardo to answer it as well. It's from Ramon Christopher Manero from Green Horizon Organics. And he's asking on introducing true prices, how much, for example, in percentage terms, would be our ideal maximum markup cost on organic produce? Eduardo, perhaps you could take that first, and then I'll come back to Bas as well with the same question.
Yeah, maybe I can give an example, because we made a study with a Dutch company actually on the true cost of food, and among others, we looked at the external cost for pest and disease control on 1 hectare of potatoes. So if we look only at the pollution that this pest and disease control had as a cost for the society, the cost was about 1,300 euros per hectare. And we compare this with the cost of what would be pest and control disease for organic, and the cost was 40 cents. So we have a difference of 1,300 euro on an hectare of potatoes. This 1,300 euro has been charged to society. So I think the question was how much markup we can give to organic products, but the question could be reversed, how we can incentivize farmers to produce organically and then avoid this cost for society. But let me say that the true cost of food is quite big science at the moment, and we're really trying to understand how this can be reflected on the price, on the final price of production for consumers. But we find very interesting to see how this could be applied on subsidies, for example, and really create a new market for public goods for farmers. So the idea is that we might have a kind of new business model for farmers who are willing to farm in a different way, reduce the cost for society, and so be rewarded by policies for the job they are doing. This could be a very interesting approach that I hope the Commission can follow also in the application, for example, of the eco schemes that now has been delegated to them to come up with some proposal. And I see Tassos is with us today. Maybe we'll mention something about that, hopefully later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Bas, the same question to you then that was sent in. What would be the ideal markup maximum price on organic produce?
Let me first of all say that I think it's a good question, but it's very narrow. And what I mean by very narrow is the fact that it only looks at the way it's produced. But let me first of all give you a brief statement that the same organic product from the Netherlands, sold in the Netherlands, has a totally different footprint than if it was an organic kiwi from New Zealand, or if it's in the season, or after 9 months in a storehouse with cooling, waiting to be sold in the store. So it's about seasonality. It's about the length of travel. It's about whether it's plant-based or animal-based. So there are a number of different indicators that identify the footprint of a product. But in general, I would say it's important that we provide the opportunity for sustainably produced food to get scale, because I think a significant proportion of the added price, for instance, for organic, but that goes for more what is currently a limited percentage of market share, is the inefficiency as a result of the scale, the inefficiency of the delivery. So if we would be able to actually take out that disadvantage, then I think the extra price that needs to be paid as a result is very limited. And people are really able and willing to pay for a few percent extra price if that is required. But it goes for an incentive on the one side for the sustainably produced food on the one side, but it also goes for paying for greenhouse gases emitted during the production cycle. And that is not a organic or conventional dilemma. It's a different dilemma. So let us in general say we need to have significant pricing of externalities in order to move in the right direction. There is a number of different parameters that define the different price from today's price. And as a result, we simply need to be willing to pay the true price after consensus on what that is, and then see a big difference in supermarket pricing going forward, but not just on the production side, but for instance also on the due date of products on the shelf. I mean, there's a lot of innovation going on when it comes to pricing just before the due date, because we simply throw away too much food that is still possible to eat, simply because we don't have the smart systems to actually do dynamic pricing just before the runoff date. And there's a lot of technology and innovation taking place also in the retail chains to actually make that happen in order to improve that situation.
So Ben, I want to put another question that is, it's also about true prices, but it's from a slightly different perspective that has come in from Pierre-Olivier Dreg, who is the ELO president. He wants to know how you deal with imported products from third countries where sustainable production is not a central issue because of the impact they will have on prices.
Okay, I mean, in New Zealand, in terms of what we import from other places, in general, we operate a very low tariff or zero tariff structure. So, so there's no tax really as such on products that come in from outside. And then it becomes a question for consumers to decide as to whether or not what sort of price they want to pay for products, perhaps from different origins, bearing in mind that origin is not necessarily always a good indicator of quality or sustainable production or anything of that sort, but consumers being consumers will make their decisions.
Okay, I want to, another question has come in and it's for the whole panel, and it's how could you encourage local farmers to interact with government to engage more on food sustainability? Bas, your thoughts on that briefly, because I want to come on to a question for all of the panel to wrap up, which I'm going to ask you for concrete ideas on. So just give me your brief thoughts in response to that question.
I'll be short. I think farmers can do better in influencing policymakers. Farmers very often tend to focus on their farm, which is their passion. But at the same time, I think as a result, it would be good if there would be a more intensive dialogue between the farming community and voters and government in order to link the sustainability agenda to their day-to-day worries on farm in order to live up to those expectations. So I think a more intensive dialogue would be welcome. And I also at the same time would hope that people who represent the consumer would stimulate the government to raise the awareness by the average consumer to actually understand what farmers are doing, how they produce their food, and how a true price and the right price and a good price for food is actually beneficial to us all.
Okay, then as a wrap-up question I'm going to ask for the whole panel is, what examples can you give me about new business models or transformative business models that could really answer some of these questions here today? What have you seen from best practice that you think should be brought forward? Eduardo, let you go first.
Yes, as I said, we need to think very holistically, and we need to create new business model to make the transition happening. I mean, organic per se is a best practice. It's we started without a market, without a regulation that was helping us to start, and then the regulation helped us to have a common play field, and we gained our market step by step. And the key was really working together, making the farmers, working with the processing industry, with the traders, with the retailers. By discussing all together, we could come up with a model that is trying to change the dynamics on the agri-food sector. So I would say the organic model can be one that we can look at it when it's about building up a new business model for a sustainable agri-food system.
Ben, what examples have you seen in terms of really concrete best practice in sorting out who pays for this? Where do we, is innovation the solution in creating more money that can go into paying for a sustainable future for everyone?
Well, I think very much innovation is the key, but I'm not necessarily convinced that it costs more to be sustainable. I think sustainability is as much about being efficient with your resources, and that sometimes means that being sustainable actually saves you money. So I'm not sure that's the question. And then as far as new business models are concerned, yes, of course, people can select to promote their products on the basis of their sustainability and tell their story accordingly. But I don't think that solves the sustainability problem, if that's what we're thinking, that there is a sustainability problem, because that requires everybody to be moving towards something that's more sustainable. So I'm not entirely convinced that the business models themselves are broken. I think it's a lot to do with alignment of incentives. It's about governments setting some clear policies and frameworks and providing the incentives for producers to become more sustainable and to provide that to consumers.
Bas, your thoughts. Do you agree that it's all about incentives, or are there new business models or transformative business models and new approaches or best practices concretely that you could point to that would ensure change?
I spent a lot of time in our biodiversity monitor that we built jointly with Royal Frisian Campina and WWF. And what I saw there is that the first dialogue between the NGO and the production company is very tough. And once you start understanding each other better, you can actually find common ground, and you can find ways to get a model that can work for all parties involved. And the same goes for what Eduardo just said. I think there are a number of elements in the organic way of producing where mainstream players can learn a lot from. I think at the same time that the organic sector can learn some of the lessons that are learned by the conventional sector, for instance, when it comes to efficiency or those types of things. So we should learn more from each other. And if we are able to make that connection also to the consumer, then I'm realistically and hopeful that they are willing to pay slightly more. And if and when we feel that that is not moving fast enough, I think there is no problem to lift the minimum standard while at the same time create a race to the top in order to stimulate innovation. So I'm optimistic that that will work as soon as the consumer becomes more aware of the impact of its daily shopping.
Thank you very much, Bas. I think that's all the time we have for on this panel. So thank you very much once again to Ben, to Bas, and to Eduardo for taking all those questions from our audience. Now, don't forget, we still want you to continue to send in questions for panel 2, which is coming up in just a moment. I want you to share on social media, use that hashtag FFA2020. Send in your questions for the panelists. As you can see, we are trying to get through them online using the form on your screen. And also we have, of course, another Mentimeter poll for you to help set the debate tone for our second session. And the question that we have here for the fourth question is, should farmers diversify from being just food producers to also farmers for biodiversity? This is a slightly trickier question because you don't have the answer of saying both. So we will let you vote in real time on that. And I will now introduce the second session. We are going to be talking about rewarding agriculture's potential solutions for biodiversity and climate change. And we will be talking to Tassos Haniotis, who is the Director of Strategy, Simplification and Policy Analysis at the Directorate General for Agriculture in the European Commission here in Brussels. We will also be talking to John Gilliland, who is the Director of Global Agriculture and Sustainability at Devonish. Marion Kroll will also join me here in the studio. She is the Senior Project Manager, Market and Food Change at ZLTO. And Ulrike Sapiro, Senior Director of Water Stewardship and Agriculture with the Coca-Cola Company, will also be joining us. Let's have a look at how the voting is going in that last Mentimeter question before I say hello once again to all our guests. We haven't got many votes on that yet. Okay, I will leave it with you. We will come back to it. So I hope to hear the thoughts of the audience soon. With that, I'm going to hand over the floor to start things off to Marion Kroll, Senior Project Manager, Market and Food Change, ZLTO. And I see all our other guests have joined us. So gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, we will be coming to you in due course. But Marion, first of all, your opening thoughts.
So first of all, I want to thank the organization for inviting me to this session. I feel honored and I enjoy sharing my experiences in farming practice with you. My name is Marion Kroll and I was born on a dairy farm in the Netherlands. And I've been working for about 20 years for the South Netherlands Agricultural and Horticulture Organization, which is an association of farmers with over 10,000 members in the south of the Netherlands. And it's my personal mission to make our food system more sustainable and to help farmers take steps in that direction. So as already emphasized by the previous speakers, the need for change is enormous and touches upon many different areas because in addition to food and affordable food prices, farming impacts biodiversity, landscape, water quality, water retention, CO2 emissions, rural livability, etc., etc. So many farmers are aware of these needs from society, but as long as they are paid only to produce affordable food, they often lack the resources to invest in this transition. So additional revenue models for sustainability are needed. And I want to give you two very practical examples of current initiatives I'm involved in addressing the issue of carbon farming and biodiversity. And both initiatives focus on revenue models to reward farmers for their regenerative activities. Well, the first example was already mentioned by Bas Rutte from Rabobank. So it's the implementation of the biodiversity monitor for dairy farming in my region. This is, as already explained by Bas Rutte, a national collaborative initiative started by the Dutch branch of the World Wildlife Fund, Rabobank and dairy cooperative Friesland Campina. The aim of the program is to reward farmers for their contribution to biodiversity by annually completing a monitor with a set of key performance indicators. Their contribution is quantified to improving biodiversity on their land. Well, in my region, different parties have agreed to use the biodiversity monitor as a basis to reward farmers, such as the 3 water boards in the region, the Drinking Water Company, nature organizations, the provincial government, and also Friesland Campina and Rabobank. All these parties have an interest in sustainable soil management, improved water retention capacity and water quality, nature and biodiversity, and thus a more sustainable food system for the future. And what is very important, they are willing to give a reward for this. For example, in the form of compensation, a plus on the milk price, cheaper land rent, or reduced interest rates. And this blending of rewards should make sustainability possible. And by using one system, it becomes easier for all parties. This year we started a pilot group of 55 dairy farmers, which will be expanded to 200 next year. And in time, we want to involve at least 600 dairy farmers. And this is only in my region. In different parts of the Netherlands, there are different similar initiatives. So the responses from the participating dairy farmers are very positive because they feel that various forms of remuneration are an acknowledgement of the fact that in addition to food, they also provide other services that require rewarding. Well, now I want to move to my second example, which is carbon farming. Well, an increase in organic matter content of soils has a positive effect on soil fertility, soil health, biodiversity, and water retention capacity. It makes our food production and our soils more resilient to climate extremes, and it can reverse climate change by storing carbon from the air in the soil. But here too, we lack a revenue model for these ecosystem services, which make it difficult for many farmers to invest in their soil. In the EU carbon farming project, we are working on developing revenue models for carbon sequestration. More and more parties want to offset their CO2 emissions. In the beginning of this year, we started a first pilot with a customer who is willing to buy this climate service from 15 farmers in our region. These 15 farmers will take extra measures on 650 hectares of land, with which they will capture nearly 3,000 tons of CO2 in the next 5 years, for which they will receive a reward of 100 euros each ton. This price is much higher than the international alternatives. But then our farmers can provide significant added value. They are local, they are close by, and they are super transparent. Customers can visit them and see for themselves how they contribute to carbon removal. And we actually receive many responses from farmers who also want to participate in this program. And as I mentioned, well, 15 farmers, it's a start. It's just very tiny, small, but we are currently in talks with various potential customers who are interested to offset their CO2 emissions. And we are developing a business case for national scale-up. So to conclude my introduction, in my work with farmers, I see a lot of potential among farmers to contribute to biodiversity restoration and reversing climate change. And I also see some important needs, and I want to mention 5. Well, the first one, rewarding, is an important incentive. We can help farmers by developing concrete services and connect them to interested customers. Secondly, knowledge is also an important incentive for farmers. Farmers want to learn how to manage their soils in a sustainable way and which measures are best in their specific situation. For instance, for carbon sequestration or increase of biodiversity. Well, a third need is certification. And this especially applies to the carbon farming initiative. It is important for those customers that we will actually deliver what we promise. To guarantee this, we need a certification system for carbon sequestration in agricultural soils. The fourth one, monitoring. At the moment, carbon sequestration can only be measured after several years. Farmers and customers want to be able to monitor the effects of their measures more closely. For this, we need a very practical way for monitoring at low cost. And last but not least, we should not forget about the market and fair food prices as incentives to increase sustainable food production. Consumers have to be informed about the true costs of food, but this is not easy, as already mentioned before. So this is my introduction. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready to answer any questions you may have.
We are pleased to welcome from DG Agri in the European Commission, Tassos Haniotis, the Director of Strategy, Simplification and Policy Analysis. Tassos, give us your opening thoughts, please, and comments.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks to the organizer for giving me the opportunity to comment. Let me start and trying to, I hadn't really prepared on purpose something concrete except for broad areas that I was going to mention, because I wanted to hear also the comments of those that spoke before me, especially because of the situation we're facing. I think it was already mentioned by Eduardo that the first thing that we have to do is to come to terms with the reality of the ongoing CAP reform, because it's exactly this reality that will show what are the possibilities of introducing some schemes and what are the limitations. I mean, somebody that has worked intensively in preparing the future CAP reform, I wouldn't say exactly that everything is thrilling of what is happening, but at the same time, I wouldn't like to underestimate the important elements that still remain that would allow us to make a better link of the future CAP to the farm to fork strategy. And it's exactly in this particular area where I think we need to start focusing concretely and start moving from more theoretical concepts about sustainability to more practical ones. And for me, there is nothing more practical than realizing that the starting point of all the discussion about where we're going to go into the future is take out some detailed satellite maps and ask ourselves the question, what do they tell us about the specific condition on soil and the nutrient balance in every single, not member state, but regions of member states more concretely. And I mentioned soil because many of the best practices that we have seen on the ground are practices where if you do good things in the soil, you end up doing very good things for air, for biodiversity, and for water at the same time. The example that was mentioned before by Mariam about what is happening in the Netherlands is one that was, I mean, we had an invitation on a group that came and spoke to the Agri about it. And it's a very interesting one because it relates to sustainability in the livestock sector. In our Agricultural Outlook conference, 3 years in a row, we brought 3 very concrete examples. We started with agroecology, with young farmers, one on agroecology in the arable sector, maize and cereals, one on rice production with precision farming, and last year one on organic farming, mainly in trees and fruits. And in all 3 of them, what we see is that there are concrete ways of improving the economic efficiency and the environmental efficiency of the farms. So the natural question is, why don't we generalize this? What is missing in terms of having people realize what are the opportunities out there? And what is missing is pretty much linked to what has been also alluded by the introduction of Janusz about the right price signals. Now, let's be clear, if we are in an urgent situation, and we are in an urgent situation, in the midst of the most major economic crisis that we would have faced for quite some time, the manner by which we try to address the right price of food has to be dealt with the sensitivity of what this implies to part of the population that will not be able to afford a more expensive food. And this is where I believe that what we have done is underestimated some very important elements in the farm to fork strategy that aim to turn this strategy into a growth strategy. Because how are we going to be able to address better food sustainability without necessarily making food too expensive? And we can do 2 very different things. First of all, we have to work on the demand side and the consumer tastes and preferences by educating much better consumers about the manner by which their products are produced and how they best meet demand. I mean, it's clear that when we talk about tastes and preferences, we talk about slow changes, but it's also clear that we talk about longer term trends that are irreversible. And these trends clearly focus a shift of consumer behavior towards products that are associated with practices that are more mild and have a much lower environmental footprint. The second thing that is probably more important to work on is on the production side and the supply of producers, because this is where the big fear comes of producers about what to do. I mean, the example that was mentioned before by Eduardo about the gap in the cost of almost 1,000 euros per hectare, which is for potatoes, doesn't generalize, is one that scares people if we only focus on this additional cost. But with productivity growth, with the use of new technologies, what we can manage to do is gradually reduce the cost of production. And you can also play a major role with that, with better regulation in certain particular areas, especially if we manage to protect many of the conditionality elements that we have put in our proposal, which still is going to go through a trilogue and further negotiations. I mentioned this importantly because part of the debate we have about the increased cost of productions, we also had it in the crisis, the food safety crisis of the early 2000s, where a series of measures that we took were considered to be increasing the cost of production. They did it in the short term, but in the longer term, what we have seen is both an adjustment of the producers and an adjustment of consumers to this new situation, which ended up in not making food more expensive in the longer term. And here is the last point, what is still very important in terms of how we pass this information to a larger part of producers. It is extremely important to put in place farm advisory systems that function in all member states. I heard before the example of Ben about New Zealand. I heard it also in visiting New Zealand back in 2004. And then is when I realized two things that happen in New Zealand that can never happen in Europe. The first one is the overnight devaluation of the New Zealand dollar by a very significant amount that make automatically New Zealand products more competitive. The second is the subsidization of banks for the loss in the asset values because of the drop in land prices. None of this can happen in Europe. I think the lesson we can get from New Zealand is a twofold. First, you do different things if you're a small country than what you do is you're a union of many countries. And second, and that's the extremely positive thing about New Zealand, is the innovative aspects in its agri-food sector. And it is around innovation that we have to make our focus. And it's passing the concrete examples, positive examples that innovative practices give us to other farmers, where we can actually really have an impact. Because the real fear that farmers have is they don't know, they know what we are asking them to do, but they don't know how exactly to do it. And here is where the very significant differences that exist in the various member states in the European Union have to be taken very well into account. And a final point on something that also that was mentioned earlier by Janus. Public money, and there is a lot of public money that is still available for the Common Agricultural Policy, should not, at least in still a significant period, go only from the provision of public goods, but also conditionally to the provision of private goods. Why? Exactly because what we have is the failure of markets to compensate food for its real cost. We should use the leverage that we have around all of the area and all of the farmers to increase the overall level of ambition. And if we manage to do that, then the additional costs that organic farming, agroecology, and other best practices have will be smaller than what you do when you have only shifting money to one part of the production and forget about what is happening in the rest. This is for the introductory part, and I'm pretty sure there are going to be plenty of questions around it later on. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure there will be many, many questions. There usually are. We'll turn now for his opening comments to John Gilliland, who is the Director of Global Agriculture and Sustainability at Devonish. John, the floor is yours.
Devonish is a livestock nutrition and innovation company. We have customers in 35 countries. And we made a big decision back in 2013 to really put our money where our mouth is. So we went out and we bought a farm. And we bought a farm in County Meath in Ireland, a pasture, grass-based farm, to actually see what are the solutions and how could we measure and manage them transparently. And so on the farm that we bought, it's in County Meath, as I said, we delivery set out our goal to see could we deliver carbon neutral beef and lamb production by 2025 while still driving profitability within those livestock farms. Having bought the farm, we sat about going to town and delivering this strategy. We looked at delivering a soil improvement program, not only on fertility, but on soil health. We looked about measuring our carbon sequestration above and below ground. We looked at then our routes of overland flow of nutrient and soil into our watercourses. We baselined our biodiversity. And in our case, we had a particular difficulty because we also host one of the last lowland wild herds of red deer, who are a rather large population challenging our carbon sequestration in trees. And if that wasn't enough, we chose a World Heritage Site to do it on. So we've got 13 monuments we need to look after. And we've been on this road now for 7 years. And as part of our reward for the route we've gone, we've also been asked to join the global network of lighthouse farms, farms that go beyond best practice and look to bring their fellow peers with it. And on this journey for us, if we are serious about rewarding agriculture's potential solutions, for us, we need to bring transparency. So we set about creating robust baselines of our key metrics using GPS, using digital technologies, starting 2014, where we did precision soil sampling analysis. And we found that when we bought the farm, we inherited 40 years of neglect of the previous farmer. And we found that our pH, our phosphate, our potash were all where they shouldn't have been. We also then, we decided rather than do satellites, we brought in an aerial survey using LiDAR. We did precision measurement of every tree and hedge in the farm. And we found out how much carbon we have above ground, both in our hedges and our trees. In 2017, we took it further. We actually did a baseline of our soil carbon down to 30 centimeters right across the farm, 88 soil pits. And what astonished us when we went looking again, just like when we went looking for our pH and P, or our difficulties there, we found under this grassland farm that had not been plowed for 40 years, that our soil carbon was about a half of what it should have been, and certainly that our neighbors' farms were, and really highlighted that soils under grassland also have problems. It's not just an issue. And this allowed us then to build up what were our carbon stocks accurately on our farm, in our soils, in our trees and hedges. And so if you're driving a strategy and trying to find solutions on how you accelerate your road to net zero by 2025, one of the key things we've done is we've actually sensitized our farm data against our livestock stocking density. Because at the moment, we average 2 livestock units per hectare under the Nitrates Directive. And currently, we are displacing 56% of all the greenhouse gas emissions on our farm because of what we're doing in our soils, because of what we're doing in our hedges and trees. But we could reduce our stocking density down to 1.25 livestock units. And at that stage, we would actually be carbon neutral today. But that doesn't really help in feeding a world that still needs livestock products as part of a balanced diet as such. So we've been looking at the solutions around that, and going back to what Tassos was saying, we went back to look at our soils. And over the last 7 years, we have completely transformed our soil pH. Our average soil pH for brown mineral soil in 2014 was 5.5. Today it's 6.6. And we've seen, again, as Tassos has flagged up, a great improvement in productivity. We have doubled the amount of forage utilized per hectare per year on that journey of 6 years of correcting our fertility deficiencies. We've also then looked at bringing in further diversity into the farm. And in Ireland and in many other places, a lot of our farms are monoculture of ryegrass. So we looked for credible research partners in Wageningen University in Research and UCD, and we secured funding under the Marie Curie award scheme with 5 PhD students looking at the benefits of introducing legumes and herbs in multi-species swards and taking it through, not only looking at the improvement of soil carbon sequestration, but actually the micronutrient content in the meat as such, and building our track record transparently around that. And the third thing we've been doing is introducing silver pasture, putting trees and animals together in the same spot. And we're greatly helped by Jim McAdam, formerly of AFBI in Northern Ireland and Queen's University Belfast, where they have 30 years knowledge of animals and trees coexisting, where they've seen carbon sequestration treble, they've seen no reduction in livestock performance, and what's more, they've been able to extend the soil trafficability window in a year, which is a big issue for us in Ireland. It always rains in Ireland, and we've been able to extend our soil trafficability by 17 weeks a year. So really been focusing on solutions, and we've always had at a macro level our eye against then how we as a company perform against the Sustainable Development Goals, and can we actually stand over that? Along with our work in Africa, in Kenya and Uganda at the moment, and our work in improving human health through our algae enrichment of chicken and eggs, we're now delivering on 11 of the 17 SD goals, which we're delighted. So for us, if we're serious about rewarding agriculture's potential solutions for biodiversity and climate change, to do that, we actually need to bring transparency and credibility about the solutions we're going to deliver. And around that, for us, we have used technology to create these robust baselines right across our natural capital and our biodiversity. This has allowed us to empower not only ourselves, but our customers, farmers as well, about the right decisions on how they manage their land. And so by empowering them and then reporting and verifying this change, we believe we can bring value to the change. Someone mentioned earlier on about carbon prices. Many of the carbon prices out there are heavily discounted today, and are heavily discounted because people are not just totally certain they are getting what they say they're getting. So for us, we want to have total transparency so that we can be independently monitored, reported, and verified of our positive journey to add value and be able to take our customers, our farming customers, with us on this journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I'm sure we're going to hear a bit more about the concrete examples and the practical experience you have in this discussion. I'm going to turn now to Ulrika Sapiro, who is Senior Director of Water Stewardship and Agriculture from the Coca-Cola Company. Ulrika, very welcome for us in person. Let's have your opening thoughts.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thanks to everybody for having me today. I find the discussion that I've been witnessing very fascinating, but I feel now really compelled to put a bit of a framing around my comments, because the practical examples that we've just heard from people really practicing farming is really a long cry from where we as a company stand at the other end of the value chain, really, that has been discussed about. But I think, nevertheless, perhaps an interesting perspective from that other direction. I think two things I think I should say before I even get started. The first one is the Coca-Cola Company and our system generally, we don't buy agricultural raw materials from farmers. We buy food ingredients. So we are touching thousands of suppliers that are processing, refining, producing food ingredients from farmers, but we don't buy directly. Secondly, our supply chain of agriculture ingredients is vast. We spend actually more money on procuring our ingredients than on marketing, which is quite a benchmark to meet. But that means that the potential influence that we can have on the supply chain is rather huge. It's very global. It touches a number of supply chains from very developing, very smallholder farming communities to very vast industrial conglomerates, of course. But that's really the landscape that we're operating in. But we really don't directly engage with farmers. And I think that's important to understand that what I'm going to say and how I'm going to talk about what we do is very much driving towards an interest of systemic change. And really what you've had in the questions earlier, the both or everybody type of answers. We totally are on that line, and that is because where we stand in that value chain. And I have basically 3 angles that I'd like to touch on. In terms of exploring a bit the drivers that I see for taking an influence and engaging in sustainable agriculture along the value chain for a company like ours. And the first one for a consumer brands company obviously is around the market. And that is predominantly around the consumers, and we've heard quite a lot of that. And as a brand company, listening and tracking consumer sentiment and understanding where consumers are going is obviously key to our business. But if you ask me, have we heard consumers so far say, yes, we want to pay more for biodiversity or we want to pay more for sustainable foods? No, of course not. And actually, the trend we will see in the next few months and probably years, unfortunately, with the very difficult economic situation is going more into affordability. I actually haven't even seen consumer consensus about what sustainable food is. I see a number of different concepts floating around and consumers changing really their particular view on what sustainability is in food. But what we see is that consumers are putting increasing emphasis on the need for the brands and the products they buy to gain their trust. And trust is very much value-based and is increasingly so. So sustainability, what we see in the consumer perception surveys, is sustainability of different kinds, and there are a very broad range of issues that consumers bring up, do drive their values and then drives consumer trust. So for consumers to make a certain choice for products is driven through trust, and sustainability plays a role. So it's indirect, but it is there. And that translates itself in the Coke system into that we have some brands and products that emphasize sustainable agriculture or sourcing as part of their brand proposition to consumers. So for example, in Europe, we have Fuse Tea that has a Rainforest Alliance seal for consumers to be clear about the origin and the sustainability of the tea and other ingredients it uses. Costa Coffee and Innocent Drinks are part of the Coca-Cola family, and they're very consumer-facing in how they source and how they engage in sustainability. But I think it is even more important for a company like ours and for generally for manufacturers that we embed sustainable supply chains in the way we do business. And so I'm really proud that ethical and sustainable sourcing is part of our company purpose, that is part and really parcel of a sustainable agriculture strategy and a continuous improvement program that we have globally with our suppliers, and that we have embedded sustainability into our other sustainability strategies, so agriculture into other sustainability strategies, particularly climate policy, the water security strategy, and human rights policy. So really embedding it across a number of issues in the business. The second element I wanted to raise is about the frameworks, i.e. the policies in which we operate and our suppliers and their farm base is operating. Because we see, and I see this really in the engagement with our procurement team and suppliers, that policies and regulations can really either create barriers or actually act like a jet stream to sustainable practices. And a large part of the work we have today and the discussions we have is to find ways to offset or overcome regulatory barriers and hurdles to drive to more sustainable practices, sometimes nevertheless or in spite of regulation. So I haven't met one farmer yet that said to me that they don't want to reduce their overall input costs or don't want to have long-term productivity or don't care about the landscape they live in or don't like to have healthy soil in the long run. But we find very often that the economic realities between managing the risks, the costs, and the income streams and revenue streams for sustainability has come up really doesn't leave them much of a choice right now than to stick with the safe choice. And the safe choice in Europe is very often defined through the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy. So I think we need to really, and the discussion here today is about unpacking that and meaning where are the barriers and where can we create that jet stream towards more sustainable practices. And that particular means, can we look at, and we need to look at the value of the natural resources, in particular water is very often an issue. Water costs are very low. On the other side, technology costs are very high. So those two elements, in particular to support innovation, are really critical. And so the Green Deal or the Farm to Fork strategy, they really can create this watershed moment if they're well thought out and effectively enable farmers to take the risk of transition and actually do things differently and not have to bear the brunt of potential issues that are arising on the way. And I would be amiss if I wouldn't mention the third point that actually hasn't come up so much in the conversation today, which is about climate change, or the climate crisis rather, and the resilience we have to drive behind that. The World Economic Forum, just to put the numbers behind it, has estimated that $44 trillion in economic value depend on nature. And that especially impacts sectors like construction, agriculture, and food and beverage. So these are the sectors that are most dependent on nature as a generator of economic value. And on the other side, we have WWF telling us that about 68% of species have declined since 1970. So it's a state of the temperature check, so to speak. But even more so, and many people overread this, that 84% of species in the freshwater ecosystems have declined. And freshwater watersheds are absolutely critical to agriculture. So what that tells, I think, us and should tell us that we really need to think about system change and about resilience. And that means we need to look beyond particular farms and particular supply chains towards really landscape solutions. A couple of examples. We work with partners and farmers in dozens of programs worldwide in water-stressed areas, including in Europe, in the UK, and in Spain, and Italy, and others, on driving water-efficient and more water-sustainable farming. That also includes managing runoff. That also includes increasing the soil health to keep water in the soil and improving the structure there. But we're also working very importantly through collaboration with others, with other buyers, with other industries, to create sort of joint and aligned expectations to farmers of what sustainable practices are and what tools and measurements and data they can actually use. So I mentioned this Sustainable Agriculture Initiative platform, or Bonsucro, or the Consumer Goods Forum are platforms that bring together different buyers and manufacturers to generate a bit of a different kind of market shift in the supply chain. And finally, and I think I've said that a few times here, we're an advocate for policy change because that ultimately is the ultimate driver for the frameworks in which we operate. So particularly in the EU, the Water Framework Directive has to be part of this conversation. The climate policy has to be part of the conversation. And more globally, we have joined the action, the call to action for nature, which is calling for more biodiversity-friendly policies. So we're in those three elements of consumer values and trusts, of collaboration and systemic change, and really the right agricultural policies that we are part of driving. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've heard our opening thoughts there from all four speakers on this panel. I think it will come as no surprise. We also heard the opening thoughts from the audience on our latest Mentimeter question, which was, should farmers diversify from being just food producers, but also farmers for biodiversity? Probably no surprise at all that the answer was overwhelmingly yes, they should. So we are going to talk about, as you mentioned, as many of our speakers have already mentioned, the various policy instruments. So I'm going to dive straight in with a question from the audience, from Donal Murphy-Bokern to Tassos. Obviously, the farm to fork and CAP are going to come up a lot here, but the question here is, he says, are we not overestimating the ability of markets to address environmental performance? We are talking about public goods for which markets fail profoundly, he says, and does not the primary responsibility for raising the bar for everyone not rest with policymakers? So it's a tough question to start you off on, Tassos, but give me your response and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of farm to fork and CAP reform.
Yeah, thanks. But tough questions is what we're supposed to answer. And in a sense, it gives me also the opportunity to answer to a comment made by Janusz. First of all, it's not the private interest I mentioned, but the private goods. That is what all farmers produce and the conditions under which they produce it. Markets fail in agricultural fail for many reasons to accurately reflect not only the environmental costs, but also the full transmission of price changes from producer to the final consumer. What we also know is that we have a fixed amount of money to spend it, and we better spend it in the best possible way. So what we have tried to do with the policy proposal we made is to make sure, first of all, that the overall level of ambition for everybody increases, so that we don't have a part of our farming sector receives money, even more money than today, to do the right thing, and the rest, by being out of the policy, does whatever they like. Obviously respecting the law, but that's not enough. It doesn't increase the overall level of ambition, because coming to a point made before, yes, we failed to mention climate change, because I think we take it for granted in Europe that climate change is the driver of the Farm to Fork, the Green Deal, and even before that, in 18, when we started discussing the future CAP of the future Common Agricultural Policy. So that's what we want to do. The important thing now is what to compensate for. And there has to be a mix of measures and of interventions that should apply in different ways in different member states. And one of my concerns in this debate that is taking place now in the Council and in the Parliament is that by focusing the discussion on ring fencing and how much and what percentage of the budget would go here or there, which maybe it's necessary to end up in a compromise, we have put in the second or the third place the priority of looking on the ground at what are the exact challenges that we face in every member state, in every part of the member state. And here is where I believe that the strategic plans of the member states, and before that, the recommendations we're going to make to the member states and the dialogue with them, would allow us to make this discussion more concrete and more diversified and differentiated. Not everybody has a problem with soil erosion. Not everybody has a problem with surplus nutrient. Not everybody has the same type of challenge in terms of emissions. But everybody, in very different ways, should use the best available practices to increase the overall level of ambition. And maybe the initial process would be gradual, but what is extremely important is, first, to make this process irreversible, and second, to use the knowledge that we get from these best practices and the transfer of this knowledge to make this process accelerating as soon as possible.
Thank you, John, as well. The question is, the EU CAP and Farm to Fork strategy, amongst other mechanisms, have to do an awful lot. They have to do several things. They need to address economic sustainability, rural regeneration, build environment and climate resilience, and ensure the transition to healthy diets. Do you think, is it possible to do all of these things at once? Or is there one area that comes out on top or should get more focus? What's your thought? It's a very complicated balancing act.
It is a complicating balancing act, but I think it has to be done, and it has to be done simultaneously. Because if you go and you deliver economics, you knock out environmental sustainability. If you push and you don't deliver healthy food, you drive then real nutritional problems in society as such. I don't believe it is too much that you can't do everything together. Certainly on the journey that we have been experiencing over the last 7 years in the lands of Doubt, we have been able to deliver improved efficiency and profitability in the farm. We've been able to deliver more nutritious food, and we've been able to drive down our greenhouse gas emissions, accelerate our route to carbon zero, improve water quality, and drive biodiversity. And we've been able to do that in a measurable way. So I don't believe it's too much. And I do actually believe there is a balance in the middle there. The one thing I will say on any journey is still make your journey transparent, because when you make it transparent, the quality of your subsequent decisions is so much easier, it's so much better, because you're making them from a more informed position. And so we have this discipline of measuring and managing, measuring and managing, measuring and managing. And by doing that, we're fine-tuning the whole time, and we're delivering on the multiple goods.
Marian, I see you nodding along there with John, agreeing with his transparency comments. But is it realistic for a policy instrument to deliver on all those very different areas all at once? And if so, how?
Well, I agree with John with that transparency and having the information on the parameters that show your results. that is very important. And if policy can help in this, because in my introduction, I also explained that the monitoring and also the certification issues, those are very important, because we have to explain to customers, and we have to guarantee that what we promise, that we will actually deliver this. So I hope in some way that policy can help in those questions.
Thank you. Now we have a question come in from Xinyi Lim, directly to you, Ulrike. And it's a question: how much is Coca-Cola investing in sustainable agriculture, and how does it arrive at that number vis-a-vis the expected benefits?
That is a very good question, but it's not easy to answer. We do not track how much we specifically invest in sustainability, because, as I said earlier, we're embedding sustainability in the way we do business. And so it is part of our conversations with the suppliers and of the specifications and the contracting with the suppliers to request and require sustainable farming assurances for agricultural ingredient supply. So, for example, we have made in 2013 a commitment and a goal to sustainably source 13 top global commodities sustainably. And we're on the progress of advancing towards that goal with our suppliers. And one very important piece of investment together with our suppliers was to establish, what does this mean, sustainable sourcing? So we set out sustainable agriculture guiding principles, a set of expectations and definitions which are transparently available on our website, and then work with our suppliers. How can they show with their supplying farms that practices that adhere and align to those sustainable agriculture guiding principles are actually being used on farm? And that, of course, is an investment that partly has been carried by the company by engaging with the suppliers, but more importantly by the suppliers to actually engage with the farmers. It's been a process over years to bring our global volume of those global commodities from 8% alignment with sustainable farming practices to 54%. So obviously there's still a lot to be done, but it is a huge progress over a relatively short period of time. The second area of investment is that we're really assessing the risks that are still residing in the supply chain, particularly when it comes to water scarcity and water sustainability, but also human rights issues. So for example, we have invested in conducting in-depth sugar industry studies in 27 countries on the sugarcane sector to understand where human rights violations and why they actually occur, and work with others to remediate those issues, in particular the root causes of some of those challenges. And thirdly, we're investing in continuous improvement. So I mentioned earlier we have, I would say, estimating about 50 to 70 programs and projects worldwide in different supply chains, from fruit juices, commodities, to sugar, to tea, coffee, and others, that actually work with farmers, particularly on human rights and social standards, but also particularly on water and climate. So direct investment in projects, risk assessment and management, and then assurance and compliance are the three areas where we invest.
Thank you. I want to come back to John now. It's a very different area from that which Ulrike is discussing, but is there a positive role for livestock when it comes to promoting biodiversity and reducing emissions? Give me that perspective, please.
Yes, there is. And people forget that, particularly ruminant livestock, the microbiome in the gut of a cow is nearly identical to the microbiome in a healthy soil. And one of the reasons that happens is that animals actually defecate in the soil. The bugs then drive the soil biologies. So actually taking ruminant animals out of a landscape, your soil deteriorates, your soil health deteriorates quite considerably. So for us, it's about finding that balance. And where we have had a problem in ruminant agriculture is where we have allowed our house systems where feces and urine come together, get ammonia emissions. And when they go on the land, ammonia is toxic to biology. So we have to look at smart solutions, or how we don't negatively impact on it, but actually how we use the benefit. It's very interesting on the farm that we are on. It had no animals on it for 30 odd years. And we have introduced a lowland suckler cow and calf system on the farm, but in a core center bit, and the outer bits we still harvest for winter fodder. And it's really fascinating to see how our soil potash and our soil biology has dramatically improved where we have had ruminant animals actually grazing the pastures on top of those soils. So it is a myth that if you get rid of ruminant agriculture, you sort out all the problems. You don't. And what we have seen in our soils, the reason our soil carbon was so low is the previous owner neglected. He didn't have livestock on it. He didn't put any lime on it. The fertility collapsed, the soil biology collapsed, and our carbon was respired and not sequestered. Soils need to be healthy. They need to be inoculated. You need to look after them. And ruminants have a key role to play on that. They should not be made a pariah when they are used in harmony and sympathy with the natural environment that they sit within.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to go to another question coming in from Globe Capital International, directly to Marion. And the question is, what is the best way forward towards reducing the use of insecticide and herbicide in the farming process? Another specific question for you.
Well, can you say the question again? Sorry.
What is the way forward towards reducing the use of insecticide and herbicide in the farming process?
Well, to be honest, I'm not a specialist in this issue of herbicides and pesticides. So, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll move on then to a more general question for the whole panel. But Tassos, I will start with you. It's the question of a carbon tax, and it is, would the introduction of a carbon tax help provide the incentive for the development of carbon trading markets that will provide another income for farmers?
Well, this is exactly the question that we'll ask ourselves when we do the specific impact assessment about the introduction of a carbon tax. This is one of several options in terms of potentially compensating farmers. There are other type of options and we have to analyze it. But when you talk about a tax and especially a carbon tax, what you have to take into account is a series of factors into consideration. And in the current moving environment, both in the economy and worldwide, I mean, it would be premature to suggest what the final answer is going to be. I think what is very important in this discussion is to keep in our mind the fact that what we have to do is address all the issues related to climate change at the global level and not just the EU level. And that is where the leadership of the European Union in terms of convincing people about what best practices are and what is the direction to take could help potentially of even arriving at a situation where this would not be necessary. But there is a very clear pressure and clear questions that we're getting from all our stakeholders that we keep setting ambitious targets, which we impose on our society, while others are not following suit. So that's exactly what we have to analyze.
Ulrike, let me ask you the same question. I mean, would the introduction of a carbon tax help? As you've heard Tassos say, he's not going to preempt any decisions at policy level, but give us your thoughts.
Well, my personal thought and my experience in engaging with our supply chain, but also really reflected of what the discussion was today, is there isn't a silver bullet. There will be a number of policy instruments, financial instruments, risk management instruments that will have to play a role. And for a very solid policy, you need to really assess what are the problems you want to solve, and then what are the options and incentives you can drive. I think the keywords that we heard today were valuing properly the impacts and externalities across the board that agriculture, the food system generally is generating, and then really working through the options of actually driving more the positive than the negative. So yeah, carbon taxes along others can play a role. My personal drive is really to ensure water security. So water and using soil in particular and soil health to not only support carbon sequestration of what we heard, but also water retention is absolutely critical. So we all have our interests here and only good ones, I hope.
John, the same question to you on carbon tax. John, I don't think we can hear you. I think you're on mute. Can we try again? Your thoughts on carbon tax?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
So I'm a great believer that there should be a price put on carbon. I am not a believer of a tax, because what happens at tax is the polluters pay and it goes into a big black hole within some government and it doesn't get redirected to actually change behavior. I am much I'm a fan of likes of the European Emissions Trading Scheme, where then, people, on one hand, you pay, if you want to be a polluter, you pay for it. On one hand, if you want to go faster and reduce your emissions more, you have something you sell. You create a market that way. And I believe that absolutely focuses both people needing to reduce their emissions, but also people wanting to go beyond best practice and actually driving their agenda faster. Because we need to energize people in this debate. A tax is a blunt instrument. An emissions trading scheme would be a far sharper instrument that at least allows people to engage positively. And for the people who want to go beyond and actually drive this agenda quicker, there will be a reward for them. Pay for positive behavioral change, beat up people who won't go on the agenda.
Thank you. We have another question in, Marion, another one for you from Nelly Lowers from the Belgian Farmers Union. And it's a long one. Food processors are more aware of sustainable farming and communicating this to consumers, which is good for bigger margins. But at the farmers level, we often see this as a rather one-way communication. How do you create a balanced relationship between a farmer or group of farmers and a big food company with a lot of different entities or centers of knowledge? Can we hear you?
Yeah, this exactly is a long question, but collaboration in the supply chain between farmers, food processors, retail is very important. And probably it starts by realizing and affirming that you need each other. So the food processors need farmers, farmers need food processors. I mean, in 2018, this was a very difficult year. We had a very extreme droughts and hot, dry summer in Northwest Europe, I think in the complete Northwest Europe. And at that moment, there was the risk of shortages of food because farmers had a lot of difficulties. And in that year, we saw that the relations between farmers, food processors, and retail were like, reconsidered. And I think that stronger connections, we can call it also dedicated food supply chains, are also relevant for sustainability.
Thank you. I want Ulrike also to respond to that, just because how do you engender this good two-way communication?
Yeah, that's a very good and a very complex issue. I had a number of situations where we worked and talked to our suppliers, and they took us to farmers, and then they said, look at all the wonderful things we do, and look at all the PowerPoint presentation and the sustainability reports we can give you that tell you what we do. And it is the truth that this is all really great stuff, but it cannot be, it's not a currency that you can trade easily along a value chain, in particular if you have several partners and players. And so I come back to, whilst it is really a nuisance for many farmers, but assurance schemes and certifications at farm level are an effective way of building the transparency across a benchmark and a level playing field of sustainable agriculture practices, and is a currency that farmers and then supply chain actors can communicate along the value chain. And in particular, if we are galvanizing around a few assurance schemes that are credible and stakeholder supported and do actually make an impact on sustainable farming practices, I think we have something like a gold nugget that we can communicate up and down the supply chain. So I mentioned earlier Sucro is a certification system for sugarcane farming in particular, so any refined sugar that comes from sugarcane would benefit from that. SCI platform, farm sustainability assessment, is more for crops in general and increasing for other agricultural materials. That is something that the industry broadly can recognize, and if farmers say we are assured against the farm sustainability assessment, then we all understand what is meant and what that actually signifies. So I think there is something in certifications and assurance schemes to help that transparent communication along the supply chain.
John, also, do you want to weigh in on that before I go to my final question?
Yes, I mean, for me, and coming back to Eureka, what she's just said about certification schemes, for me as a primary producer, certification schemes are the bare minimum license for me to, to farm. But it doesn't differentiate my product from my neighbors or my competitors' product. So for us, we want to invest in sustainability in a transparent manner so that we can communicate what we're doing over and above anybody else is doing. Because the scale of change that we need, it's not good to be in the herd going at the herd. We need entrepreneurs and innovators and pioneers and early adopters to get on and go beyond that and keep driving positive change. So for me, we are very keen in working with farmers, with our customers, with other farmers about how they can go that step further, but do it transparently so they can then share their positive journey with their supplier, with the retailer. And the feedback we've had is the level of transparency we're bringing. Retailers want to engage, because it's the next stage beyond the standard verification that we all have to do. It's the next stage beyond. And more and more consumers are wanting to know where their product comes from. They want it to be authentic. They want trust in that, but they want to know that what journey you're on, what direction you're on that journey, and the speed that you're going. And that's why for us, we believe that we need to go to the next stage is personalized agenda, measure and manage, show transparency in your journey. The retailer will come with you.
Thank you, John. So my final question for the session and for today is to Tassos. The title of this session is Rewarding Agriculture's Potential Solutions for Biodiversity and Climate Change. In the first panel, we asked a lot of questions about who pays. And I'm wondering, do you think there are enough instruments at your disposal currently to really reward? We hear a lot about the stick, but not so much the carrot in driving sustainability.
Yes, I think there are enough instruments, and that's why we haven't had many alternative instruments. What we are really missing is the best way of targeting this and convincing people that they are there. An earlier question was about whether this is feasible or not. If you look at the example of John and Marion, if you look at the three examples we brought in our agricultural conferences, what do they indicate? They indicate that there are practices out there that farmers improve their income, their competitiveness, their soil, they reduce emissions, they improve biodiversity. Most of them are linked with generational renewal. They are linked to growth in rural areas. So 7 of the 9 objectives we want. They're driven by innovation. And then what are the other 2 objectives we have set? Shrink the distance that exists between producers and consumers in the food chain and respond to consumers and society's broader concerns. All of these things are possible. And it's not the measures that we're missing. What we're missing is belief that these measures work on the ground. And what we're missing is a very targeted communication that will convince people that this is not about problems, the problems we have, and they're for everybody. It's also about opportunities and a growth strategy. And obviously, all the institutions and all the stakeholders involved need to do their best, because we have nothing to gain by over-polarizing a debate, and we have everything to gain if we actually try to convince, first of all, ourselves and then the wider public that in the current situation we're facing, we can marry, jointly deliver economic and environmental efficiency without adding a social cost.
Thank you very much, Tassos Haniotis from DG Agri, and also to our other panelists, John Gilliland, Marianne Kroll, and Ulrike Sapiro. I want to thank all the panelists from the earlier panel as well, Eduardo Cucco, Ben O'Brien, and Baz Rutter. And right back at the beginning, of course, we received our framing for the whole debate from the FFA chairman, Yanis Potočnik. I think we've learned one thing, and that is that there is no size fits all. The two panels both discussed the role of all partners in driving sustainability and the use of all the different methods and policy instruments in driving sustainability. We heard it in the last panel that there is no silver bullet, but there is equally a lot of different bullets we can use that may be more like gold nuggets, I think was the phrase we used. I would like to thank again the partners today, which is Syngenta, the Nature Conservancy, Cargill, WWF, Food for Thought, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, Rabobank, and John Deere. This event has been videoed, so it will be available on the FFA website. You can view it there soon. You can also tune in to listen to podcasts and find out more information about that. And finally, to wrap up, thank you all for your attention this afternoon, for the great questions that you sent in to our panelists, for tweeting and sharing on social media. I have been using all my devices to try and keep an eye on that, so please do continue to do that into tomorrow and the rest of the week using the hashtag FFA2020, and also stick in your calendars a save the date for March 2021 for FFA 2021. And with that, I say thank you and have a good evening.